Good morning, Alcorn. This is Mr. Hawkins, 6th grade, 7th grade English language arts teacher. For BYOBB, I am reading an awesome book called Reach, written by Ben Jealous and Travian Shorters. And the book is detailing 40 success stories from African-American gentlemen. And there's one story in here by a gentleman named Sheikha Senghor that actually caught my attention. I wanted to read the story to you all, and it's very uplifting. And after I read the story, if you see me in the hallway or you see me in the cafeteria, I encourage you to come and speak to me and tell me what you thought about the story. Okay, I'm going to start reading now. When I was 16, I caught a case and ended up in a youth home. There was a girl I was seeing prior to getting locked up. And when I went away, she moved on to someone else. When I got out, she tried to reconnect with me, even though I knew she was with someone else. So we got into an argument about it, and she ended up calling her boyfriend. I remember I was standing around the corner with one of my partners when the boyfriend rolled up, like, "What's up?" We exchanged words, and I thought he wanted to fight. But instead of getting out the car to fight, he started shooting. The first two hit me in my leg, and I just remember running, thinking I didn't want to be shot in the back of my head. I was lucky that he only managed to shoot me again in the foot before I got away. I was bleeding profusely, waiting for the ambulance as long as I could. You know, in the hood, we had no expectations of the ambulance coming. I remember this feeling of vulnerability and never wanting to have this happen again. I didn't like feeling vulnerable. I didn't like feeling like somebody could come kill me over relatively nothing. So when I came out of the hospital limping on crutches, I was super defiant. The first thing I did, I bought a pistol and started carrying it with me every day. I made up my mind at that point that if I ever got into a conflict, I would shoot first. A little over a year later, I did get into another conflict over a drug transaction going wrong. I refused to sell to a guy I didn't know. It got out of hand. We exchanged words, and I shot first. I tragically caused his death. I was sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. You would think that's the end of the story in most cases, but it's not. It marked the beginning of a long journey, one that I could not have possibly imagined at that time. My life has been like that, unpredictable, in both bad ways and amazingly good ways. I grew up on the east side of Detroit in the 1970s. Most of my days in the neighborhood were spent playing and eating fruit from the trees in different backyards. I was a happy child for the most part. At a certain point, my parents started having marital issues, and I started changing. I became less focused in school. I started running away from home, staying with whatever friends would have me. That was right when crack was being introduced in Detroit. I got sucked into the crack culture. I was exposed to probably every horrific thing you can imagine in that environment. I was robbed at gunpoint by some addicts. One of my childhood friends was murdered in front of a crack house. I became addicted to smoking laced joints, which were crack-laced weed. By the time I left the neighborhood to serve my time at age 19, I was a very different person from the young boy who grew up eating fruit from the trees. When I first got to prison, I vowed I would not leave the way I came in, and not necessarily in a good way. I told myself I wanted to leave more skilled at hustling, more callous and cold-hearted in terms of how I would take over my community at home. For the majority of the rest of my sentence, I was either in maximum security or close custody. Most of the guys with me were serving 10 to 100 years in prison. I ran a store inside the prison and had guys who worked for me and guys who feared me. I was on course to become the best predator I could be, if I ever got out. That all changed in October 1999 when I received a letter from my son. I was in solitary confinement where I spent nearly 5 years of incarceration. Solitary is dehumanizing. It's degrading. You're in your cell 23 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 24 hours a day, 2 days a week. Each time you come out, they put on handcuffs that are attached to a dog leash. When you go take a shower, it's just a cage. It makes you start detaching yourself from your own body. But it was in this environment that I had the real breakthrough. I was sitting in my cell in solitary when the guard handed me a letter from my son. He wrote, "Dad, Mom told me why you're in prison." Reading this letter was heartbreaking because I finally realized what my son saw when he looked at me. He saw me as a person that committed one of the worst acts that humans can commit, which is to take another person's life. He saw me as a monster. At that point, I realized that I had to do something different. I remember sitting there, having a conversation with myself, realizing this is not the human being I was raised to be. And I realized that if I ever got out of prison, I refused to leave as an animal, as a savage. So I started writing a journal. I wrote when I was angry. I wrote down the things that happened with my mother, the things I experienced in the streets and growing up. It was really about getting my thoughts out so I could see them. And then I would go back and read my thoughts. And I was like, this is the most absurd stuff you can imagine. Like, this is not how normal human beings think. I discovered so much about myself. I discovered that I started a whole lot of stuff but never really completed anything other than a GED. So I challenged myself to write a book. I started to structure my days in solitary confinement like a classroom. I would study political science and philosophy in the morning and then write for the rest of the afternoon and evening. I ended up publishing my first novel from prison in 2008. It was called Crack, Volume 1. I would write everything on pads and send them out to my family on the outside and be like, copy this, and send them to different publishers. I kept writing. By 2010, I had finished a few novels, worked on a project with the people who did Chicken Soup for the Soul, and co-produced a children's book for children with incarcerated parents. I had several job offers on the table if I was paroled. I was prepared for a life after prison. I went up in front of the parole board, but they denied me. I was devastated. I told myself I would never go in front of the parole board again, but my family convinced me otherwise. A few months passed, and the parole board ended up calling me back early. I didn't have to wait a whole year, which is the normal process. About 3 weeks after I saw them again, I was walking back from the gym when an officer stopped me and told me I was getting out of prison in 60 days. I didn't want to believe him. What if he was wrong? I was released from prison on June 22nd, 2010, one day after my 38th birthday. I remember walking around the track outside where we would have recreation time. While I was walking, I was thinking about what this all means. At that point, I had 19 years in it. I had spent basically half of my life in prison, and I just knew I was coming out to a very different world. I moved in right away with my wife and son. I started grinding nonstop, hitting up local bookstores, volunteering in schools, talking about writing. I wanted to reach out to these kids, make sure that they didn't make the same decisions that I made that led me to prison. I created a nonprofit called Heart of the Matter, where we would go into schools and encourage kids to write about what's going on in their everyday lives. They would write about gun violence, physical and sexual abuse, drug culture, you name it. These kids were living their worst nightmares. I was volunteering when my nephew was shot. He was driving in a car with a childhood friend when it happened. After he was shot, he got out of the car and he was just laying on the ground, bleeding to death. And people were just driving past. Initially, nobody would stop to help. Eventually, someone took him to the hospital. His friend died right there. When we got to the hospital, I was just standing with him. And all his friends came to visit. Young kids from the neighborhood. They were riled up saying, "We got to find out who did it." Things like that. They were already planning revenge. And I'm looking at all these cats and I see that they got on Rest in Peace t-shirts. It turns out a different young guy in the neighborhood had just been killed not too long ago. That did it. These cats were mourning one young man. They were at the hospital bed of another young man. And they were already planning revenge on a third young man. I was like, damn, this is a fascinating statement. This is where we're at. At that point, I knew I was going to change the name of my program from Harder Than Matter to Live in Peace. The idea was to replace all the Rest in Peace t-shirts in the hood with Live in Peace t-shirts. But I really wanted to impart the Live in Peace ideology to the kids. You know, when you're resting, you're lying down, you're chilling, or you're dead. You ain't getting much accomplished. But to live, you have to be very productive. Living is more than merely existing. What I find is that so many people in our community just exist. They're just going through day to day. But living is more than existing. You have to be very proactive. You've got to make something happen. You've got to engage people and connect with people. You have to share spirits. That's living to me. It's what's changed my life. Growing up in cities like Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Columbia is really rough. Many times the limitations we place on ourselves are based on how we think about what we're worthy of. But once again, you begin to understand that your thoughts have power, like real power, that makes a difference. You realize that if you put those thoughts into the universe, you're going to attract whatever you think about most. And if it's a bunch of negativity, failure, and excuses, that's what you will attract. If it's about positive, infinite possibilities, then you will realize how powerful a being you are, and you'll start moving in that life. I've been around people who told me everything that I wouldn't be able to accomplish as a result of being incarcerated. And I've proven them wrong every step of the way. Becoming an MIT Media Lab Fellow, giving a TED talk, teaching a class at the University of Michigan, all within 3 years of being released. I don't think in terms of limitation. I think in terms of infinite possibilities. BME Community was the first organization to publicly acknowledge me as an asset to society in 2012, before any of those other titles came along. A lot of people ask me, are you scared to go back to prison? I'm like, dude, I served half my life in prison. I can survive prison. That's not a scary world to me. For me, the motivating factor is realizing that I'm a human being who grew up in some unfortunate circumstances and made some poor decisions. I refuse to allow that to define me for the rest of my life. I just refuse to allow that to dictate what I can and cannot do. I want to use my story as much as possible to tear down those barriers. I'm really passionate about being an example for the guys and giving them hope. Because hope, man, hope is the saving grace. Thank you, Alcorn.